Quebec is to ban prayer in public. So most of my following on Instagram, most of my subscribers on YouTube are from the United States. And while this is a nice country, a great country, they are off Americans, my experience, are often ignorant of what goes on outside of their own borders. This is a problem because there are matters that affect the Catholic faith that have absolutely nothing to do with U.S. politics. Charlie Kirk, who was recently assassinated, a great tragedy. However, he was not a Catholic martyr. However, meanwhile, there are things going on in the wider world that do affect the Catholic faith that American Catholics know squat all about, which would normally be okay. Like, countries can focus on their own issues, except that you have Americans going online, hearing that someone is insert like Trump, insert not like Trump, therefore they are good, therefore they are bad. And the result is they end up cheering on the guy who is actively tearing down the Catholic faith inadvertently. So, in Quebec, the Quebec government has announced it intends to table a bill to outlaw and criminalize acts of prayer in public. Now, for the record, yes, legally, under Canadian law, they can do this, and no, there is really not a whole lot that the Canadian courts can do, or the federal government can do, because it is not the whole country, it is the province of Quebec, and indeed, our current Liberal federal government thinks that this is an overreach. There's not a whole lot that can be done about it. This is the situation that should confirm everyone on the face of the earth, everyone in Canada, everyone in the United States, everyone in the world, and it is worth knowing what's going on and why this is happening. So, for starters, I want to talk about why this prayer ban is being considered, and why it matters for us as Catholics. For starters, initially, I know some right-wing commentators have been praising this from the United States. Largely, this is because this is being done in response to Muslims' prayers taking place at protests outside of cathedrals, at Notre Dame in Montreal, and this is seen as a great way of fighting back and defending the Christian heritage and the heritage of the West in general against Islamic aggression. Now, I of course am not a Muslim. I think Muslims should convert, and I do think we, as Christians, should use the civil arm as far as is possible to defend the Christian nature of the West, use it to promote its restoration. Problem is that is not what is going to happen. So here's something that has to do with the history of Quebec. Quebec, as part of its national ideology within the nation of Canada, that was recently made officially by law in 2019, is laicité. Basically, it is that religion has no place in the state and no place in public life, and that is ideology. It is essentially a Masonic ideology. Both the American Revolution and laicité come from this ideology. However, whereas the United States is more libertarian, this is a more authoritarian system. So, for example, a prayer ban would ban not just Muslims praying in public, but in theory, depending on how it's laid out. Again, we do not know how this law is going to pan out. We are still waiting on that. If I took my rosary out, walked around Montreal, quietly said my rosary, not bothering anyone, in theory, I could also be arrested for doing so. Largely because laicité does not distinguish between Muslim religion or Catholicism. It is inherently anti-Christian ideology. In fact, laicité was made as a reaction against Catholic authority and the presence of the Catholic Church in Quebec and its power during the 1960s. It is an extreme rejection of Catholicism. that is considered by law a founding ideology of the province of Quebec. That we essentially, literally, that we hate religion. And I've heard stories of people who've gone to Quebec. Thankfully, I visited there. Look at some of my previous YouTube videos. I'm in Quebec for an SSPX Mass. I'm there in Quebec for visiting Saint Anne de Beaupré, the relic of Our Lady's arm. And from what I've heard from people who've gone there, I had the good fortune of not experiencing this directly myself, but people apparently hate all religion in Quebec. The polls, from what I understand, for support for banning all prayer, and they are very adamant when you go online, you see in the commentaries from Quebecers, they are very adamant that they do not just want to ban Muslim prayer, they want to ban Catholic prayer as well. All prayer. In other words, if you are a Catholic, if you're a Bible-believing Christian, if you're a Protestant, you want to take your Bible read in a public park or say the Rosary, you can be charged every bit as much as a Muslim. There is no distinction. The ideology is we hate religion. I cannot emphasize it enough. Quebec is no longer a Catholic society. It is decidedly anti-Catholic and is militantly secularist. What is more, this transcends ideological lines within Quebec itself. So even if you have a right-wing politician or a left-wing politician, both will believe in laicite. Both will support. It'd be like saying, so if you're Americans, it'd be like saying, do the Democrats think the American Revolution was good and a foundational principle of the United States, or do the Republicans believe that? Truth is, they both do. And they will both consider it a founding principle. And but they might, what that exactly should mean, how it should be applied, may differ. But it is within the same school of thought of the American Revolution. Similarly, there are really just about every political party, I think maybe one, supports this. The support for these laws of discriminating against anyone who has any religion publicly, and believing that prayer is something that should be exclusively in the home and in churches and has no place at all in public, is a majority opinion of Quebec, and a strong majority. 64%, as I recall, of Quebec support bringing in this law. The federal government, which is liberal under Mark Carney, regards this as an overreach. So if you are an American and you're supporting free speech, you should be siding with Mark Carney, because the people who are supporting Quebec in this are the conservative governments of Canada. For example, Doug Ford has said that this is a provincial issue. It is not the job of the federal government to manage this issue. And yes, this does mean that Quebec gets to ban people's individual rights to pray in public. Alberta has said very much the same thing, that this is a provincial matter, but out. Now, normally you would think this would be illegal under Canadian law. And the fact of the matter is, that is indeed the case. In the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, there is right to freedom of expression, and freedom of religion, and freedom, yes, to express that religion publicly. The thing is, in Canadian law, we have something called the notwithstanding clause. It allows both provincial and federal governments to say that even though something is a charter right, it can be suspended by the government for a period of 4 years because it is causing various problems. The essential idea behind this practice is to prevent a dictatorship of the judiciary. So if, let's say, many years back, before same-sex marriage was brought into the United States by the ruling of the Supreme Court, South Carolina had a referendum. They voted that they wanted marriage defined between being one man and one woman. This was overturned, of course, by the Supreme Court. Now, if they had a similar law in the United States, South Carolina could say, no, we are the people of North Carolina. We make the laws here, and the legislature can, for a period of 4 years, invoke the notwithstanding clause to keep that law out of North Carolina, and saying Carolina marriage will be defined as being between one man and one woman, for example. Similarly, if you have a state in, say California, decides that the ban on guns is unreasonable and ridiculous and dangerous, they can similarly invoke the same clause and say you know what? This is unreasonable in our society. We're going to ban it. And in most cases, most other provinces outside of Quebec, Quebec is rather famous for using and abusing this charter right of provinces, that it is used for more common sense measures. And when it is invoked, it is basically to prevent an activist judiciary or individual groups that are literally doing things that are dangerous that normally would be legally on technicality be protected by charter rights, but are just harming others. So, for example, I believe New Brunswick, in 2019 invoked the notwithstanding clause to mandate that parents need to vaccinate their children against, I think, like measles, mumps, and rubella, for example, because they said it was becoming a public safety hazard. On Alberta has also invoked the notwithstanding clause, or is planning to, basically to say that you cannot teach children. To basically say that children in schools, if they want to identify as another gender, they can do that, but they must get parental permission first. A school cannot unilaterally do that. The parents must be informed, even though the wording of the charter would make people would the wording of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms would essentially say that that's a freedom of speech. Even though they're a kid, they have that right, and so that must triumph even against the will of the parents. That would be a normal, probably technically correct reading of the charter as it is. And essentially, it is used more for things like that elsewhere, and is sparingly used. Ontario as well, a few years ago, used the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, invoked the notwithstanding clause in the Charter to forcibly reorganize the City Council in the City of Toronto. It is generally rarely used by provinces. Pierre Poilievre, also the leader of the Conservatives, has also invoked the notwithstanding, or said he wants to invoke the notwithstanding clause, rather, if he became prime minister, to make it illegal. Not make it illegal. Basically say that if you basically, what was he wants to do again? Basically, that he said that if you want to charge people for drug possession, you will no longer need to prove it beyond a reasonable doubt to get a conviction. Essentially, get rid of the notion of the burden of proof. Basically, he says he wants to get rid of the presumption of innocence in criminal cases concerning drugs and drug trafficking, which I think even Donald Trump and everyone in the United States, however hard they may be on the law, is not considering going that far, as far as going after drug dealers. Which, mind you, Pierre Poilievre is not as crazy as it sounds. He's not doing presumption of guilt. He says I want to replace it with what's more likely. So it is part of Canada's constitution and law. That being said, this is controversial because Quebec is known for using it endlessly. They're the ones who insisted that this be part of our charter, and they have used it to do the following: make it a crime to speak English. I'm not joking. Government services in Quebec have to be offered in French, or they'll let you do it for practical reasons, but only for 6 months. Then you have to learn French by that period in order to see government services, if I recall correctly. There's language laws that essentially penalize businesses if they use English too much, and they enforce it when and they literally ban. From what I've heard, they banned loan words like pasta from other languages because they want to keep their version of French pure. They are very adamant about it. Most of Canada is okay with this, for the most part. In fact, the attitude of Canada, people on the ground where I live, when I mentioned what's going on in Quebec, it's very much, that's Quebec, who cares? It's their business. Just don't go to Quebec, is very much their attitude. The government of Canada, however, the Liberal Party in particular, is very much opposed to this because it is a very blanket punishment on all religions, essentially. Catholics too, Christians as well, and most religious people in Canada are very much against Quebec doing this. This includes the Catholic Archbishop of Quebec. This would potentially also ban the SSPX pilgrimage from Saint from the SSPX Parlement to Saint Anne de Beaupré, as you have to walk through the streets and pray in the streets to the pilgrimage. This would technically become illegal in Canada, as would Eucharistic processions in the streets, which would also, both by the local Novus Ordo Archdiocese as well as Society of St. Pius X, make processions of Our Lady would all become illegal under this law. That is why even the Archbishop of Montreal, whose cathedral Muslims are praying in front of, has said this is overkill. And to be fair, they have a point. Critics of this ban have pointed out accurately that in Canadian law there already exists means of dealing with this behavior. If you do not want, you cannot be, there is a limit. Remember, Canada as society is very much based on etiquette. So for example, you cannot obstruct traffic by law. So if Muslims are praying and blocking in the streets, there's no reason to ban Muslim prayer. You just say, okay, we will arrest you if you pray in the streets. And that would be considered a reasonable limit on freedom of religion, because you're blocking traffic, or you cannot intimidate or constantly be provoking people outside of a cathedral in prayers, or be threatening people if you're Muslim. That would also be considered a reasonable limit, which is also part of Canada's Charter of Rights and Freedoms, is that free speech, freedom of religion are to be bound by reasonable limits. For example, I can, under Canadian law, say a lot of things. I can say that there's one true church outside of which there's no salvation, which I believe. I cannot, however, call on people to go and unalive my religious opponents. And I would be reasonably and rightly arrested for doing so. So a lot of people are saying, in Quebec, there are already plenty of laws to prevent Muslims from having intimidatory prayers outside of Notre Dame Basilica Cathedral in Montreal. There are already laws in place to ban Muslims from blocking the roads. So the question is, why aren't those being used, and why are they trying to bring in a law that bans all prayer? The reason is because dealing with Islamic extremism is only the pretext. That is generally the vibe that a lot of people who know Quebec have mentioned, that this is only a pretext. That basically is about enforcing laicite upon the entire population, basically saying that if you are religious and want to pray the Rosary in public, you're as bad as the Muslims who are intimidating the people outside the church and the cathedral. So to any American watching, you know how in Canada, in Nova Scotia, my province, if you pray the Rosary outside of the abortion clinic, you can be arrested, because that is illegal. It's considered an illegal way to protest. A lot of you Americans are watching would consider that tyrannical. The law that Quebec is considering would ban that Rosary not just being moved 100 feet away, but would not allow such a rally to take place if prayer is involved in public, period. It would not allow you cannot have a Rosary rally for life in Quebec anymore if this law is to take place, which it probably will. You cannot, even in a public park, even if it's 100 miles away, if it's on the end of the city, you're outside praying the Rosary, nowhere near an abortion clinic, and the police come by and seeing you're having Rosary, you're praying outside, you're not in a church, you can be arrested. Theoretically, yes, and Quebec is known for enforcing laicite quite a bit. So to anyone who may be watching, I'm Canadian. Most of my subscribers and followers on Instagram are American. what should this mean for people outside of Canada who are concerned about this? For starters, you should not just be presuming that everything you should not make your entire decision about a foreign country based on a single Instagram reel. This goes for Canada and everywhere else. If you do believe in freedom of speech and freedom of religion for the church, even if it's just for the Catholic Church, then this should concern you gravely, as will prevent Catholics from praying in public just as much as Muslims will. You can still oppose Muslim intimidation. You can still oppose Muslims blocking off roads. There are other means of doing so under Canadian law. You should not be cheering this on. Also, and this is something I always say, that you should leave the left-right dichotomy behind. The Conservatives in Canada are basically throwing religious people who live in Quebec under the bus. If you are Christian, religious, and you want to go pray outside in public, even if you're not disturbing anyone, they're allowing they are saying we don't want to protest. No one should protest Quebec if they want to make that a crime. That is what they have said explicitly. It is, for as crazy as the Trudeau Liberals may have been, and they were, I lived under them, they are the ones who are saying this is overkill. Yes, there are good reasons for having the notwithstanding clause. I've heard it said many times, and in Canadian history this is true. We probably would not have a charter because of how diverse the country is between English and French, even that alone, if there was not a notwithstanding clause. I know that Prime Minister Carney is concerned because he's saying Quebec is using it so much, and he's using curtail such basic freedoms that he's basically reducing the Charter of Rights and Freedoms to nothing. If you ban freedom of religion in protest in public, okay, then that's nothing. If you are a constitutional conservative in the United States and say that Canada is tyrannical, it wasn't tyrannical under Trudeau. I lived under him. Yeah, cancel culture was crazy, but there were due limits. I could just go elsewhere. This is not the case. Also, not all of Canada is the enemy. It is a bunch of conservatives throwing people under the bus. It is the province of Quebec mainly. And honestly, your allies, if you do support that, or if you do support for either freedom of speech or liberty ecclesia, both of which are being threatened by this law, your allies in this matter is the Carney Liberals. In this instance, probably won't be for other things, probably not for pro-life, but that is the reality. So that is a bit of Canadian history. I could do a whole podcast on how Canada got this way as a country. It is essentially a cultural trade-off. Canada is happily largely nonviolent. We really do not like things like Charlie Kirk, which is a terrible event. I don't care. I agree with him on half of his things. I disagree with another half of his things. But he should not have been shot. Happily, that generally does not happen here. That is part of the trade-off in Canadian culture that we have. We do have governments that can do this. However, one of the side effects of that is, look, we don't have as much of a dictatorship of the judiciary. We can vote. We can vote out governments that evoke the notwithstanding clause inappropriately if we think they've gone too far. Problem is, in Quebec, this is one of the reasons why Plato hated democracy. Eventually, you get people using their freedom to take away everyone else's, is essentially what happens. That is a trade-off. Just as in the United States, sometimes when your attitude is liberty or death, sometimes you get death. And sometimes when you say we want security over freedom, usually you get both. Sometimes you don't. It's a trade-off, and it's a balance for both countries. And there are cases in both Canada and the States where there are poster childs in both countries where it's gone too far. They're both countries that sometimes can be poster childs on why either excessive amount of freedom can work, or Canada can at times be a great poster child for why limiting freedom can work and putting the collective good above personal freedom is a good idea. And there are times when both of us are poster childs for why it can go too far. Many in Canada, I think it has gone too far, especially those on the left, and I will support those who support liberty ecclesia and the freedom of the church. And in this particular instance, yes, it is the Carney Liberals. Mind you, my opinion is not the only opinion. Again, I am not Quebecois. If you are Quebecois, please comment down below. Again, if you completely think I'm off to lunch here, that is entirely valid. That being said, if you do disagree with me, please address my points. If you say, oh, you don't know what you're talking about, tell me why you don't know what I'm talking about. Tell me why none of this makes sense or is real or is valid. If you're American, feel free to comment, or more accurately, ask questions. Try to understand the situation. And regardless, pray for liberty of the church in Quebec. God bless. Have a great day. If you have a good fortune having an SSPX chaplain in real life, please do so, and God bless. I'd like to say end this with three Aves for liberty of the church in Quebec. Noli Patris, Filii Spiritus Sancti, Amen. Ave Maria, gratia plena Dominus tecum, benedictus et benedictus fructus ventris tui, Iesu, Sancta Maria Mater Dei, pro nobis peccatoribus, nunc et nostre, Amen. Ave Maria, gratia plena Dominus tecum, benedictus et benedictus fructus ventris tui, Iesu, Sancta Maria Mater Dei, pro nobis peccatoribus, nunc et nostre, Amen. Ave Maria, gratia plena Dominus tecum, benedictus et benedictus fructus ventris tui, Iesu, Sancta Maria Mater Dei, pro nobis peccatoribus, nunc et nostre, Amen. Noli Patris et Filii Spiritus Sancti, Amen.